Welcome to Unsolved Cases. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we will explore a story that has captivated America for nearly 5 decades. A story of raw power, violent corruption, and an enduring mystery that continues to baffle investigators and fascinate the public. This is the story of James Riddle Hoffa, a man who rose from poverty to command the most powerful union in America, who made enemies of presidents and allies of mobsters, and who simply vanished into thin air on a summer afternoon in 1975. You might know Jimmy Hoffa from pop culture references. Maybe you've seen that scene in Bruce Almighty, where Jim Carrey's character stumbles upon Hoffa's body. A joke that plays on the fact that only divine intervention could solve what has stumped humanity for decades. But the real Jimmy Hoffa was far more complex, dangerous, and influential than any Hollywood portrayal could capture. We're going to unravel the complete saga of America's most notorious union boss, from his hardscrabble beginnings to his meteoric rise, from his epic battles with the Kennedy family to his mysterious disappearance that spawned countless theories and confessions. This is a tale of American capitalism at its most brutal, where the line between legitimate business and organized crime became so blurred it virtually disappeared. If chilling cold cases like Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the Black Dahlia case, the Zodiac killings, and the Lindbergh kidnapping keep you hooked, then Unsolved Cases by Skoob is the podcast you can't miss. Perfectly tailored for your busy schedule, these quick, binge-worthy episodes bring you gripping cold cases and shocking revelations, whenever, wherever. Step into Skoob, the AI-powered podcast app, offering over 100,000 minutes of intense true crime stories and a passionate community of over 50,000 listeners nationwide. Download Skoob today on the App Store or Google Play and dive deep into the darkest unsolved mysteries like never before. Now, our story begins on Valentine's Day, 1913, when James Riddle Hoffa was born into a world that would teach him early that survival meant fighting. When Jimmy was just 7 years old, his father died, leaving his mother to support 4 children in the most desperate of circumstances. Picture this woman, working 3 jobs simultaneously: full-time cook in a restaurant, cleaning houses, and doing laundry at home. This was the crucible that forged Jimmy Hoffa's character. In 1924, seeking better opportunities, the family moved from Brazil, Indiana, to Detroit, a city that would become synonymous with Hoffa's name. At 14, most kids are worried about homework and making friends. Jimmy Hoffa dropped out of school and became a stock boy in a department store, working exhausting 6-day weeks for $12. That's roughly $200 in today's money. When the stock market crashed in 1929, he switched to the night shift at a warehouse, where workers faced a particularly cruel arrangement. They were only paid for the hours spent unloading boxcars, often waiting unpaid for hours between shipments. This is where the legend truly begins. At just 17 years old, an age when most people are figuring out their college plans, Jimmy Hoffa led his first strike. Along with 2 others, he refused to unload a shipment until the company agreed to negotiate better working conditions. Think about the audacity of that moment. A teenager taking on a corporation in 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, when jobs were scarce and workers were desperate. But Hoffa didn't just rebel. He strategized. He negotiated the first contract and aligned his new union with the Teamsters. This caught the attention of Detroit's Joint Council, who hired him as an organizer. And here's where Hoffa's story takes its first dark turn into the violent world of labor organizing in Depression-era America. As a union organizer, Hoffa faced a reality that modern workers can barely imagine. Employers routinely hired local mob members to break strikes, with police departments openly siding with companies against workers. Labor disputes weren't just heated negotiations. They were literal battles where Hoffa's own brother was shot, underlining just how dangerous this world was. But here's what made Hoffa different from other labor leaders. He fought fire with fire. When employers hired one gang to break his strikes, Hoffa retaliated by hiring members of a different local gang to resist the employer's muscle. This wasn't just pragmatism. It was the beginning of a relationship with organized crime that would define the rest of his life and, ultimately, lead to his downfall. Through these violent confrontations, Hoffa forged relationships with the mob that proved instrumental to the Teamsters' success. He understood something that other union leaders either couldn't or wouldn't accept. In a system rigged against workers, sometimes you had to break the rules to win. By age 21, Hoffa had become the top Teamster in Detroit. By 27, he was chairman of the Central States Drivers' Council, negotiating with employers across 23 states. 2 years later, he was president of the Michigan Conference of Teamsters. This wasn't just rapid advancement. This was a meteoric rise that defied every convention of union politics. What made Hoffa so uniquely powerful? The answer lies in his revolutionary philosophy about unions and capitalism, a philosophy that his surrogate son Chuckie would later describe in colorful terms. Unlike the social reformers in the labor movement of the 1930s and 1940s, who saw unions as instruments of social change and challenges to American capitalism, Hoffa viewed the union purely as a business entity. His goal was simple: sell labor in the marketplace for the highest possible price. Chuckie later dismissed the more idealistic wing of the labor movement as social shit, specifically targeting figures like Walter Reuther, whom he called a wacky commie. This wasn't just rhetoric. It represented a fundamental philosophical divide that would reshape American labor relations. Hoffa's experiences during his youth and the brutal labor battles of the 1930s had convinced him that the market was inherently rigged in favor of the powerful. As historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. observed, Hoffa saw capitalism as a manipulative system orchestrated by the strong for their benefit, a world where morality was inconsequential and opportunism reigned supreme. If the system was corrupt, Hoffa reasoned, why should he be bound by its rules? This philosophy led him to view every interaction as a market opportunity aimed at increasing his power. Whether he was negotiating labor contracts, bribing politicians and police, engaging in lucrative ventures with employers, or forming alliances with organized crime figures, it was all just business, with only two considerations: currency and price. This approach proved devastatingly effective. Hoffa controlled the trucking industry, which was vital to the national economy, and experienced explosive growth after World War II as America built its interstate highway system. By the early 1960s, he had organized an extensive membership of truckers and related workers into the nation's largest union, wielding enormous control over transportation and, thus, significant influence over the entire national economy. But here's the tragic irony. While Hoffa had the potential to redirect the American labor movement's trajectory in ways that could have benefited millions of workers, his disregard for legal and social norms and his deep association with criminal elements ultimately undermined everything he built. The collision between Jimmy Hoffa and the Kennedy family was inevitable. It was a clash between two different visions of American power, one rooted in the rough streets of Detroit, the other in the privileged halls of Harvard and Washington. When these worlds collided, the reverberations would shake the foundations of American politics and law enforcement. In 1952, Hoffa achieved his greatest political triumph, becoming international vice president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. But he wasn't content to share power with President Dave Beck. Hoffa's ambition was breathtaking in its scope. He wanted to control not just the Midwest, but the East Coast as well. In a move that perfectly exemplifies his willingness to bend rules to achieve his goals, Hoffa convinced Beck to establish 7 paper locals in New York. These weren't real union chapters serving actual workers. They were controlled by members of the Thomas Lucchese crime family. Despite 5 of the 7 locals having no actual members, they would be eligible to vote in Hoffa's anticipated 1957 bid for the Union presidency. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation that would make modern vote-buying schemes look amateurish. But Hoffa's ambition nearly cost him everything when the McClellan Committee Senate hearings began investigating labor racketeering in the mid-1950s. Led by Chief Legal Counsel Robert F. Kennedy, these hearings put organized labor under an unprecedented microscope. Most union leaders would have seen this as a mortal threat. Hoffa saw it as an opportunity. In a move that demonstrates his Machiavellian genius, Hoffa secretly provided information that led to Dave Beck's downfall, clearing his path to the presidency. But he overplayed his hand when he tried to infiltrate the committee itself. Hoffa recruited Wall Street lawyer John Cy Cheasty, a former Secret Service agent, Internal Revenue agent, and Naval Intelligence commander, to spy on the McClellan Committee and provide him with relevant documents. On paper, Cheasty was perfect for the role. In reality, he was Hoffa's first major miscalculation. Cheasty reported the entire scheme to Robert F. Kennedy. This betrayal marked the beginning of a blood feud that would consume both men for the rest of their lives. When John F. Kennedy became president and appointed his brother Bobby as Attorney General, the pursuit of Jimmy Hoffa became a government obsession. Robert Kennedy's campaign against Jimmy Hoffa represents one of the most controversial chapters in American prosecutorial history. It was a pursuit so intense, so personal, and so comprehensive that it fundamentally altered how the federal government would use its power against individuals who attracted its attention. By the early 1960s, Kennedy's pursuit of Hoffa had escalated far beyond normal law enforcement. Under RFK's directive, the Department of Justice was committed to destroying Hoffa by any means necessary, investigating every facet of his life, deploying every tool of governmental pressure, and targeting his associates to break down his network. Even supporters within the Justice Department recognized that Kennedy's methods bordered on harassment and personal vendetta. This wasn't just about prosecuting crimes. This was about prosecuting a person. The Kennedy administration established what they called the Get Hoffa Squad, led by Walter Sheridan, whose sole mission was to find something, anything, that could put Hoffa behind bars. The implications of this approach were staggering. While pretextual prosecutions had been used against organized crime figures since at least 1931, when the federal government imprisoned Al Capone for tax evasion rather than his more notorious crimes, RFK's public, persistent campaign against Hoffa was particularly troubling because it demonstrated how such tactics could be turned against any citizen who aroused government disfavor. The Kennedy administration didn't stop with traditional law enforcement. They revolutionized the use of the Internal Revenue Service as a weapon of political warfare. Previous administrations had occasionally used the IRS for law enforcement purposes, but the Kennedys systematically included the IRS in investigations unrelated to tax issues. They established political loyalty criteria for top IRS positions and created the Ideological Organizations Project, which scrutinized groups they disapproved of with the aim of reducing their influence through punitive audits or revoking tax-exempt status. While the Kennedys didn't extend their IRS abuse as extensively as Richard Nixon would later, they set the precedent that Nixon would follow when he used the agency to destroy political adversaries. The Kennedy administration's tactics against Hoffa became the template for future prosecutorial overreach, referenced in subsequent cases like Ken Starr's investigation of Bill Clinton in the 1990s and John Ashcroft's pursuit of terrorism suspects after 9/11. The feud between Hoffa and Robert Kennedy reached its most dangerous point in August 1962, when Hoffa's rage finally boiled over into something truly sinister. The scene was Hoffa's office in the Teamsters' lavish headquarters in Washington, the Marble Palace, where he called his close associate Ed Parton to the large picture window overlooking the Capitol dome. What happened next reveals just how far Hoffa was willing to go in his war against the Kennedy family. In a conversation that would later be reported to federal authorities, Hoffa inquired about procuring plastic explosives, sketching out 2 potential assassination strategies against the Attorney General. The first plan was horrifyingly simple: bombing Kennedy's Virginia residence at night with plastic explosives, ensuring that the entire family would perish. Hoffa actually drew a layout of the Kennedy estate for Parton, showing he had done reconnaissance on the property. The second plan involved using a long-range rifle to kill Kennedy while he drove in his convertible, preferably in the South, where the attack could be blamed on white supremacists opposed to the Kennedys' civil rights policies. Think about the calculation behind these plans. Hoffa wasn't just plotting murder. He was planning a political assassination that would eliminate his primary enemy while creating plausible deniability through misdirection. This wasn't the work of a hothead. This was the strategic thinking of someone who had spent decades manipulating complex situations to his advantage. But for all his cunning, Hoffa made a critical error in trusting Ed Parton. Unknown to Hoffa, Parton had already become an FBI informant. Walter Sheridan, head of Kennedy's Get Hoffa squad, would later note that if anything had happened to Kennedy, Hoffa would have been the obvious suspect, making him too smart to carry out the attack personally. Parton's betrayal extended beyond reporting Hoffa's homicidal intentions. He also provided information about Hoffa's involvement in jury tampering during a Nashville trial, giving federal prosecutors the evidence they needed to finally bring charges that would stick. The irony is staggering. Hoffa's own paranoia and violent impulses created the very informant who would provide the government with the tools to destroy him. His hatred of Robert Kennedy had blinded him to the most basic principle of criminal enterprise: trust no one completely. Discoveries in cold cases arise from relentless dedication and the determination to re-examine even the tiniest clues. It's an ongoing quest where every detail, no matter how long forgotten, might reveal the truth. If this episode sparked your inner detective, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to Unsolved Cases on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Your next breakthrough could be just one episode away. Returning to the Jimmy Hoffa case, in March 1967, Jimmy Hoffa began serving his 8-year sentence, and the criminal underworld celebrated. This might seem counterintuitive. After all, Hoffa had been organized crime's most valuable ally within legitimate institutions. But his imprisonment created an opportunity that the mob had only dreamed of: unfettered access to the Teamsters' massive pension fund. Hoffa's successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, lacked both the will and the ability to resist criminal exploitation. Where Hoffa had maintained some control over mob access to union resources, using it as leverage in his complex relationships with crime families, Fitzsimmons opened the floodgates completely. According to a 2002 study on organized crime within the Teamsters, Fitzsimmons' leadership enabled figures like Alan Dorfman and his mob connections to gain almost unlimited control over pension fund loans. The cruel irony was unmistakable. Robert F. Kennedy's relentless campaign to destroy Hoffa had inadvertently granted organized crime unprecedented access to exploit one of America's largest pools of legitimate capital. This represents one of the most spectacular examples of unintended consequences in American criminal justice history. Kennedy had spent years trying to break the connection between the Teamsters and organized crime, but his success in removing Hoffa actually strengthened that connection immeasurably. The ramifications extended far beyond the Teamsters. RFK's tactics against Hoffa established dangerous precedents for prosecutorial conduct that would echo through decades of American law enforcement. His willingness to target an individual rather than specific crimes, his use of government agencies for political purposes, and his tolerance for prosecutorial overreach became a playbook that future administrations would follow and expand. The Kennedy administration's transformation of the IRS into a political weapon proved particularly influential. While they didn't abuse the agency as extensively as Nixon would later, they demonstrated its potential as a tool of political warfare. The ideological organizations project they created to target groups they opposed through tax investigations became the model for future political weaponization of tax enforcement. Kennedy's personal crusade against Hoffa also compromised the appearance of fair justice that's vital for the credible exercise of prosecutorial power. The fact that the Attorney General was the brother of a president committed to imprisoning a specific individual created the appearance of a political vendetta rather than impartial law enforcement. In December 1971, Jimmy Hoffa walked out of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, a changed man in some ways, but unchanged in others. 5 years behind bars had softened his intimidating presence and given him a cause, prison reform, that allowed him to rehabilitate his public image. But his fundamental ambition remained as fierce as ever. He wanted his union back. Hoffa's target was the 1976 Teamsters election, but he faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Nixon's commutation of his sentence came with a condition barring him from union activities until 1980. Rather than accept this restriction, Hoffa launched a sophisticated campaign to overturn it through every available means. His strategy was multi-pronged and brilliant in its scope. First, he worked to improve his public image through passionate advocacy for prison reform. In speeches, congressional testimony, and press interviews, Hoffa detailed the horrific conditions he had witnessed: rampant drugs, violence, and rape that often left inmates more prone to crime than before their imprisonment. His proposed reforms were comprehensive and genuinely progressive. But according to Chuckie, this wasn't just altruism, it was strategic genius. Prison reform advocacy gave Hoffa a legitimate reason to travel across the country and meet with Teamsters who still revered him. In these meetings, he subtly discussed labor issues and built support for his return. Every city welcomed him with enthusiastic crowds and promises of support. His mail was flooded with letters from admirers urging his comeback. Simultaneously, Hoffa was working behind the scenes to challenge his legal restrictions. He made generous donations to politicians, senators, and congressmen who might help overturn Nixon's ban. He attempted to get his jury tampering conviction overturned using a dubious affidavit from Edward Parton, the same man who had betrayed his assassination plots against Robert Kennedy. Success would mean he had served his time for the pension fund conviction, potentially negating the union activity ban entirely. His first major television interview after prison, on ABC's Issues and Answers, demonstrated that his intelligence and charisma were intact. He discussed everything from criminal justice to American labor and politics with such skill that even Chuck Colson told President Nixon that Hoffa's performance was impressive. By 1973, Hoffa was privately expressing his displeasure with successor Frank Fitzsimmons, though he continued to praise him publicly. The stage was being set for an epic confrontation that would determine the future of America's most powerful union. The date was July 30th, 1975. The time was 2:30 p.m. The place was the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit. Jimmy Hoffa, the former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, arrived expecting to meet with two notorious mafia figures, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone from Detroit and Anthony Tony Provenzano from New York. He never returned. What happened in those crucial hours has become one of America's most enduring mysteries, spawning countless theories, investigations, confessions, and wild speculation. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa represents more than just an unsolved crime. It's a symbol of the dark intersection between legitimate American institutions and organized crime. To understand why Hoffa vanished, you have to understand what he represented to so many different factions by 1975. To the mob, he was both an asset and a liability, a man who could deliver access to the Teamsters pension fund, but who also knew too many secrets about their operations. To Frank Fitzsimmons and his allies, Hoffa represented an existential threat to their control of the Union. To federal investigators, he was a key to understanding decades of labor racketeering. The meeting at the Maachus Red Fox was supposedly arranged to resolve Hoffa's conflicts with Tony Provenzano, conflicts that dated back to their time together at Lewisburg Penitentiary. Provenzano believed he was unjustly denied his rightful pension from the Teamsters and blamed Hoffa for failing to rectify the situation. Their feud had escalated to the point where Anthony Giacalone had advised Hoffa to reconcile with Tony Pro in conversations in December 1974 and May 1975. But when Hoffa arrived at the restaurant that afternoon, neither Giacalone nor Provenzano was there. After waiting about 30 minutes, Hoffa made several phone calls, expressing his frustration at being stood up. Then, sometime around 3:30 p.m., he simply vanished from the parking lot. What makes this disappearance so fascinating is not just the "who did it" question, but the "who didn't" question. At least 3 mafia hitmen, Donald Francos, Louis Melito, and Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, have claimed responsibility for killing Hoffa. The possible motives are equally numerous. Hoffa was accused of embezzling mob funds. Fitzsimmons supporters wanted to prevent his return to Union leadership. Hoffa possibly knew too many damaging secrets about organized crime's involvement in other high-profile murders. The FBI's investigation quickly focused on 2 primary conspirators, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. A 1978 Department of Justice memorandum laid out the evidence against both men, revealing a web of relationships, motives, and suspicious communications that pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plot. Giacalone was a prominent figure in the Detroit mob scene, with a long-standing relationship with Hoffa. The evidence against him was compelling. He had reportedly met with Hoffa 3 times before the disappearance, ostensibly to discuss pressing issues. Hoffa apparently expected to see him at the Maachus Red Fox. Most damning, Giacalone's alibi, claiming to be at the Southfield Athletic Club, seemed suspicious and aroused FBI skepticism. But why would Giacalone personally serve as the lure, knowing it would incriminate him? It seemed unnecessarily risky to place himself in the spotlight of a murder investigation. This puzzle would haunt investigators for decades. Provenzano, a captain in the Genovese crime family, had been crucial in establishing Hoffa's control over Teamsters operations in New York and New Jersey. He had served on the Teamsters executive board for years, cementing his influence within the union. While he had an alibi, being at Local 560 in New Jersey during Hoffa's disappearance, he quickly emerged as a central suspect. The evidence against Provenzano was largely circumstantial but compelling. Hoffa had told workers at a taxi service that he planned to meet both Giacalone and another Tony, presumably Provenzano. Witnesses confirmed the long-standing feud between Hoffa and Provenzano dating back to prison. James P. Hoffa told the FBI that Giacalone had advised his father to reconcile with Tony Pro in multiple conversations leading up to the disappearance. 3 months after Hoffa vanished, Little Ralphie Picardo, a known Provenzano associate imprisoned for second-degree murder, began providing detailed information to authorities. Picardo claimed he had witnessed confrontations between Provenzano and Hoffa in Miami in November 1973, after which Provenzano allegedly ordered hits on Hoffa that never materialized. Most sensationally, Picardo alleged that after Hoffa's disappearance, Provenzano's associates confided their involvement, revealing that Hoffa's body had been transported to New Jersey by Gateway Transportation Company. He implicated Salvatore Briguglio as a triggerman for Provenzano, and an eyewitness claimed to have seen Briguglio in the Maachus parking lot. However, the FBI remained skeptical of Picardo's claims. Over time, discrepancies emerged in his story, and independent corroboration proved elusive. As FBI agent Jim Dooley remarked, invoking Mary McCarthy's famous quote about Lillian Hellman, he would only believe Picardo if sufficient corroborative evidence surfaced. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Hoffa disappearance investigation centers on Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, the man Hoffa had raised as his own son. Within weeks of the disappearance, the FBI developed a theory that would define the case for decades. Chucky, under orders from Giacalone, and possibly unaware of the ultimate plan, had picked up Hoffa and delivered him to his killers. The evidence against Chucky was entirely circumstantial, but it was extensive and damning. Federal investigators found possible traces of Hoffa's scent and hair in the car Chucky had borrowed that day. Chucky had suddenly canceled a planned trip to Toronto. He was in the vicinity of the Machus Red Fox on the day of the disappearance. After Hoffa vanished, Chucky met with Giacalone. There was a crucial time gap during which no witness could account for his whereabouts. He had developed loyalty to Giacalone that seemed to supersede his relationship with Hoffa. His relationship with his adoptive father had become strained, and, after the disappearance, he appeared reluctant to fully cooperate with investigators. The FBI's logic was compelling. Chucky was one of the few people who could have convinced the paranoid and security-conscious Hoffa to get into a car. If Chucky wasn't involved, the evidence against him represented an extraordinary series of coincidences. But this theory had significant problems that the FBI either ignored or explained away. On July 30th, 1975, Chucky showed no intention of going to the suburbs until late morning, when he received a salmon delivery that prompted him to call Joey Giacalone about borrowing his car. If Chucky was planning to pick up Hoffa, why didn't he arrange transportation in advance? Even more puzzling, if this was a planned mob hit, why would they use the car belonging to Joey Giacalone, the son of the man believed to have organized the murder? It seemed illogical to transport Hoffa in a vehicle that could so easily be traced back to the conspiracy. The timeline also presented problems. The FBI claimed Chucky left his location around 2:20 to 2:30 p.m. and returned to Local 299 around 4:30 p.m. But this focused on the wrong time period. The relevant question was whether Chucky could have picked up Hoffa when he actually disappeared, around 3:30 p.m., and still reached Local 299 when he was first spotted there, potentially much earlier than 4:30 p.m. When you factor in the time required to drive from the Machus Red Fox to Joey Giacalone's workplace, pick up Joey, and then drive to Local 299, the window for diverting Hoffa elsewhere becomes impossibly narrow. Decades after the disappearance, Chucky O'Brien made one of the most unusual decisions in the history of this case. He agreed to take a polygraph test on national television to prove his innocence. The venue was the Maury Povich Show, and the date was January 7th of an unspecified year in the 1990s. Dressed in a snug white sweater with large tinted glasses, Chucky cut an imposing figure as he faced Povich's cameras. "I'm fed up with the headlines in this country implicating me in driving this man to his death," he declared. "I have had enough. This has torn my family apart." The show's format was classic daytime television drama. Povich questioned Chucky directly about whether he had unknowingly driven his adoptive father to a meeting with connected individuals in Detroit. Chucky maintained his innocence, adding with characteristic fatalism, "If this were true, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I'd be gone." The tension escalated when another guest appeared. Kenneth Walton, an FBI agent who had led the Hoffa investigation in Detroit from 1985 to 1988. Walton's accusation was direct and inflammatory. "There are two people in this room who know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. I'm not speaking out because I don't want others to be killed. Chucky knows, and he's not speaking because he fears for his life." This confrontation enraged Chucky, who later admitted, "He nearly got out of my chair and knocked him down." But instead of resorting to violence, Chucky made an extraordinary offer. He would take a lie detector test administered by an expert of Povich's choosing to prove his whereabouts on that crucial day. Against the advice of multiple lawyers who had counseled him over the years, Chucky found legal representation that approved the television polygraph. The show hired Natale Lorendi, a renowned figure in lie detection, who had retired from police service to run his own firm, boasting a national reputation for distinguishing truth from deception. The results, announced on a subsequent episode, were unambiguous. "Yes, indeed, he passed," Lorendi confirmed. "As far as I'm concerned, he was truthful when he said he was not in a car with James Hoffa on the afternoon of July 30th, 1975. Nor was he part of any plot to harm James Riddle Hoffa. Chucky O'Brien is, in my view, uninvolved in the disappearance of James Riddle Hoffa." Povich showcased footage of the polygraph questions and Chucky's responses, creating a dramatic television moment that nonetheless raised as many questions as it answered about one of America's most enduring mysteries. Nearly 5 decades after Jimmy Hoffa vanished from that parking lot in suburban Detroit, his story continues to fascinate and confound us. The search for his remains has become a recurring American ritual. Investigators have dug up farms, demolished buildings, searched swamps, and followed hundreds of tips that led nowhere. Rumors about his final resting place have included everything from beneath Giant Stadium to being processed in a meat rendering plant. Multiple confessions have emerged over the years, most notably from Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a Teamster official and mob hitman who claimed on his deathbed to have killed Hoffa at a house in Detroit. But like every other confession, Sheeran's account raised more questions than it answered. The true tragedy of Jimmy Hoffa's story isn't just his disappearance. It's what his life represents about American capitalism, labor relations, and the corruption of legitimate institutions. Hoffa rose from genuine poverty to command enormous power, but his methods ultimately destroyed the very movement he claimed to serve. His willingness to ally with organized crime gave him short-term tactical advantages, but created long-term strategic vulnerabilities that proved fatal. His philosophy of treating everything as a market transaction, where morality was irrelevant and only power mattered, may have made him individually successful, but undermined the broader labor movement's moral authority. The Kennedy family's obsessive pursuit of Hoffa established dangerous precedents for prosecutorial overreach that continue to influence American law enforcement today. Their willingness to weaponize government agencies for political purposes and to target individuals rather than specific crimes created a playbook that future administrations would expand and abuse. Perhaps most ironically, Robert Kennedy's successful campaign to destroy Hoffa achieved the opposite of its intended goal. Instead of breaking the connection between organized crime and the Teamsters, it actually strengthened that connection by removing the one man who maintained some control over mob access to union resources. The story of Jimmy Hoffa is ultimately a story about the corruption of American institutions, not just by criminals and corrupt officials, but by a system that rewards short-term tactical thinking over long-term strategic wisdom. It's about the price of power, the cost of revenge, and the unintended consequences of even well-intentioned actions. As we continue to search for Jimmy Hoffa's remains, perhaps we should also be searching for the lessons his story offers about power, corruption, and the delicate balance between justice and revenge in American society. Because until we understand not just what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, but why it happened and what it means, we'll never truly solve the mystery of one of America's most notorious disappearances. The legend of Jimmy Hoffa lives on, not just in our popular culture, but in the institutions and precedents his life and death created. And maybe that's the most important discovery of all, that some mysteries matter less for their solutions than for what they teach us about ourselves. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and you've been listening to Unsolved Cases. Thanks for joining me as we unraveled the layers behind the Jimmy Hoffa case. This mystery remains one of the most compelling unsolved stories, and while the full truth may remain out of reach, the quest for answers pushes us to question justice, uncover hidden truths, and face the shadows of the past. If this episode piqued your interest or left you with questions, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.